Chapter 1 of The Gentle Grafter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Leslie Walden. The Gentle Grafter by O.Henry. Chapter 1. The Octopus Maroon. Now, trust is its weakest point, said Jeff Peters. That, I said, sounds like one of those unintelligible remarks such as, "Why is a policeman?" It is not, said Jeff. There are no relations between a trust and a policeman. My remark was an epigram, an axis, a kind of mulctum in parvo. What it means is that a trust is like an egg, and it is not like an egg. If you want to break an egg, you have to do it from the outside. The only way to break up a trust is from the inside. Keep sitting on it until it hatches. Look at the brood of young colleges and libraries that's chirping and peeping all over the country. Yes, sir, every trust bears in its own bosom the seeds of its destruction, like a rooster that crows near a Georgia-colored Methodist camp meeting, or a Republican announcing himself a candidate for governor of Texas. I asked Jeff jestingly if he had ever, during his checkered, plaided, mottled-pied, and dappled career, conducted an enterprise of the class to which the word trust had been applied. Somewhat to my surprise, he acknowledged the corner. Once, said he, and the state seal of New Jersey never bit into a charter that opened up a solider and safer place of legitimate octopussy. We had everything in our favor: wind, water, police, nerve, and a clean monopoly of an article indispensable to the public. There wasn't a trust buster on the globe that could have found a weak spot in our scheme. It made Rockefeller's little kerosene speculation look like a bucket shop. But we lost out. Some unforeseen opposition came up, I suppose, I said. No, sir. It was just as I said. We were self-curbed. It was a case of auto-suppression. There was a rift within the loot, as Albert Tennyson says. You remember I told you that me and Andy Tucker was partners for some years? That man was the most talented conniver at stratagems I ever saw. Whenever he saw $1 in another man's hands, he took it as a personal grudge if he couldn't take it any other way. Andy was educated too, besides having a lot of useful information. He had acquired a big amount of experience out of books and could talk for hours on any subject connected with ideas and discourse. He had been in every line of graft, from lecturing on Palestine with a lot of magic lantern pictures of the annual Custom-Made Clothiers Association convention at Atlantic City, to flooding Connecticut with bogus wood alcohol distilled from nutmegs. One spring, me and Andy had been over in Mexico on a flying trip, during which a Philadelphia capitalist had paid us $2,500 for a half interest in a silver mine in Chihuahua. Oh yes, the mine was all right. The other half interest must have been worth $2,000 or $3,000. I often wondered who owned that mine. In coming back to the United States, me and Andy stubbed our toes against a little town in Texas on the bank of the Rio Grande. The name of it was Bird City, but it wasn't. The town had about 2,000 inhabitants, mostly men. I figured that their principal means of existence was in living close to tall chaparral. Most of them were stockmen, and some gamblers, and some horse speculators, and plenty were in the smuggling line. Me and Andy put up in a hotel that was built like something between a roof garden and a sectional bookcase. It began to rain the day we got there. As the saying is, Juniper Aquarius was sure turning on the water plugs on Mount Amphibious. Now there were 3 saloons in Bird City, though neither Andy nor me drank. But we could see the townspeople making a triangular procession from one to another, all day and half the night. Everybody seemed to know what to do with as much money as they had. The 3rd day of the rain, it slacked up a while in the afternoon. So me and Andy walked out to the edge of town to view the mudscape. Bird City was built between the Rio Grande and a deep, wide arroyo that used to be the old bed of the river. The bank between the stream and its old bed was cracking and giving away when we saw it, on account of the high water caused by the rain. Andy looks at it a long time. That man's intellect was never idle. Then he unfolds to me an instantaneous idea that has occurred to him. Right there was an organized trust, and we walked back into town and put it on the market. First, we went to the main saloon in Bird City called the Blue Snake and bought it. It cost us $1,200. Then we dropped in casual at Mexican Joe's place, referred to the rain, and bought him out for $500. The other one came easy at $400. The next morning, Bird City woke and found itself an island. The river had busted through its own channel, and the town was surrounded by roaring torrents. The rain was still raining, and there was heavy clouds in the northwest that presaged about 6 more mean annual rainfalls during the next 2 weeks. But the worst was yet to come. Bird City hopped out of its nest, waggled its spin feathers, and strolled out for its matutinal toot. Lo, Mexican Joe's place was closed, and likewise the other little Dobie life-saving station. So naturally, the body politic emits thirsty ejaculations of surprise, and ports Helm for the Blue Snake. And what does it find there? Behind one end of the bar sits Jefferson Peters, octopus, with a 6-shooter on each side of him, ready to make change or corpses as the case may be. There are 3 bartenders, and on the wall is a 10-foot sign reading, "All drinks $1." Andy sits on the safe in his neat blue suit and gold-banded cigar, on the lookout for emergencies. The town marshal is there with 2 deputies to keep order, having been promised free drinks by the trust. Well, sir, it took Bird City just 10 minutes to realize that it was in a cage. We expected trouble, but there wasn't any. The citizens saw that we had them. The nearest railroad was 30 miles away, and it would be 2 weeks at least before the river would be fordable. So they began to cuss, amiable, and throw down dollars on the bar till it sounded like a selection on the xylophone. There was about 1,500 grown-up adults in Bird City that had arrived at years of indiscretion, and the majority of them required 3 to 20 drinks a day to make life endurable. The Blue Snake was the only place where they could get them till the flood subsided. It was beautiful and simple, as all truly great swindles are. About 10 o'clock, the silver dollars dropping on the bar slowed down to playing 2-steps and marches instead of jigs. But I looked out of the window and saw 100 or 2 of our customers standing in line at Bird City Savings and Loan Company, and I knew they were borrowing more money to be sucked in by the clammy tendrils of the octopus. At the fashionable hour of noon, everybody went home to dinner. We told the bartenders to take advantage of the law and do the same. Then me and Andy counted the receipts. We had taken in $1,300. We calculated that if Bird City would only remain an island for 2 weeks, the trust would be able to endow the Chicago University with a new dormitory of padded cells for the faculty, and present every worthy poor man in Texas with a farm, provided he furnished the site for it. Andy was especially inroaded by self-esteem at our success, the rudiments of the scheme having originated in his own surmises and premonitions. He got off the safe and lit the biggest cigar in the house. "Jeff," says he, "I don't suppose that anywhere in the world you could find 3 cormorants with brighter ideas about down-treading the proletariat than the firm of Peters, Satan, and Tucker, Incorporated. We have sure handed the small consumer a giant blow in his soul apoplectic region, no?" "Well," says I, "it does look as if we would have to take up gastritis and golf or be measured for kills in spite of ourselves. This little turn of bug juice, verily, is all on the ski boat, and I can stand it," says I. "I'd rather batten than bant any day." Andy pours himself out 4 fingers of our best rye, and does with it as was so intended. It was the first drink I had ever known him to take. "By way of liberation," says he, "to the gods." And then, after thus doing umbrage to the heathen diabetes, he drinks another to our success. And then he begins to toast the trade, beginning with Rasuli and the North Pacific, and on down the line to the little ones like the school book Combine and the oleomargarine outrages, and the Lehigh Valley and Great Scott Coal Federation. It's all right, Andy, says I, to drink the health of our brother monopolists, but don't overdo the wassail. You know our most eminent and loathed multi-corporations live on weak tea and dog biscuits. Andy went in the back room a while and came out dressed in his best clothes. There was a kind of murderous and soulful look of gentle riotousness in his eye that I didn't like. I watched him to see what turn the whiskey was going to take in me. There are two times when you can never tell what is going to happen. One is when a man takes his first drink, and the other is when a woman takes her latest. In less than an hour, Andy's skate had turned to an ice yacht. He was outwardly decent and managed to preserve his aquarium, but inside he was impromptu and full of unexpectedness. Jeff, says he, do you know that I'm a crater, a living crater? That is a self-evident hypothesis, says I, but you're not Irish. Why don't you say creature according to the rules and syntax of America? I'm the crater of a volcano, says he. I'm all aflame and crammed inside with an assortment of words and phrases that have got to have an exodus. I can feel millions of synonyms and parts of speech rising in me, says he. And I've got to make a speech of some sort. Drink, says Andy, always drives me to oratory. It could do no worse, says I. From my earliest recollections, says he, alcohol seemed to stimulate my sense of recitation and rhetoric. Why, in Brian's second campaign, says Andy, they used to give me 3 gin rickeys, and I'd speak for 2 hours longer than Billy himself could on the silver question. Finally, they persuaded me to take the gold cure. If you've got to get rid of your excess verbiage, says I, why not go out on the riverbank and speak a piece? It seems to me there was an old spellbinder named Cantharides that used to go and disincorporate himself of his windy numbers along the seashore. No, says Andy, I must have an audience. I feel that if I once turn loose, people would begin to call Senator Beveridge the Grand Young Sphinx of the Wabash. I've got to get an audience together, Jeff, and get this aureole distension assuaged, or it may turn on me, and I'd go about feeling like a Deckle-Edge edition deluxe of Mrs. E.D.E.N. Southworth. On what special subject of the theorems and topics does your desire for vocality seem to be connected with, I asks. I ain't particular, says Andy. I'm equally good and varicose on all subjects. I can take up the matter of Russian immigration, or the poetry of John W. Keats, or the tariff, or cable-y literature, or drainage, or make my audience weep, cry, sob, and shed tears by turns. Well, Andy, says I, if you're bound to get rid of this accumulation of vernacular, suppose you go out in town and work it on some indulgent citizen. Me and the boys will take care of the business. Everybody will be through dinner pretty soon, and salt pork and beans makes a man pretty thirsty. We ought to take in $1,500 more by midnight. So Andy goes out of the Blue Snake, and I see him stopping men on the street and talking to them. By and by, he has half a dozen in a bunch listening to him. Pretty soon, I see him waving his arms and elocuting at a good-sized crowd on a corner. When he walks away, they string out after him, talking all the time, and he leads them down the main street of Bird City, with more men joining in the procession as they go. It reminded me of the old legerdemain that I had read about in books about the Pied Piper of Heidsieck, charming the children away from the town. 1 o'clock came, and then 2, and then 3 got under the wire for place, and not a Bird citizen came in for a drink. The streets were deserted except for some ducks and ladies going to the stores. There was only a light drizzle falling then. A lonesome man came along and stopped in front of the Blue Snake to scrape the mud off his boots. "Pardner," says I, "what has happened?" This morning there was hectic gaiety afoot, and now it seems more like one of them ruined cities of Tyre and Siphon, where the zone lizard crawls on the walls of the main portcullis. "The whole town," says the muddy man, "is up in Sperry's wool warehouse listening to your sidekicker make a speech. He is some gravy on delivering himself of audible sounds relating to matters and conclusions," says the man. Well, I hope he'll adjourn sine qua non pretty soon, says I, for trade languishes. Not a customer did we have that afternoon. At 6 o'clock, 2 Mexicans brought Andy to the saloon, lying across the back of a burro. We put him in bed while he still muttered and gesticulated with his hands and feet. Then I locked up the cash and went out to see what had happened. I met a man who told me all about it. Andy made the finest 2-hour speech that had ever been heard in Texas, he said, or anywhere else in the world. What was it about, I asked. Temperance, says he. And when he got through, every man in Bird City signed the pledge for a year. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Gentle Grafter. Lisbeth Peters has been engaged in as many schemes for making money as there are recipes for cooking rice in Charleston, South Carolina. Best of all, I like to hear him tell of his earlier days when he sold liniments and cough cures on street corners, living hand to mouth, heart to heart with the people, throwing heads or tails with fortune for his last coin. I struck Fisher Hill, Arkansas, said he, in a buckskin suit, moccasins, long hair, and a 30-carat diamond ring that I got from an actor in Texarkana. I don't know what he ever did with the pocket knife I swapped him for it. I was Dr. Wahoo, the celebrated Indian medicine man. I carried only one best bet just then, and that was Resurrection Bitters. It was made of life-giving plants and herbs accidentally discovered by Taquala, the beautiful wife of the chief of the Choctaw Nation, while gathering truck to garnish a platter of boiled dog for the annual corn dance. Business hadn't been good in the last town, so I only had $5. I went to the Fisher Hill druggist, and he credited me for half a gross of 8-ounce bottles and corks. I had the labels and ingredients in my valise, left over from the last town. Life began to look rosy again after I got in my hotel room with the water running from the tap and the Resurrection Bitters lining up on the table by the dozen. Fake? No, sir. There was $2 worth of fluid extract of cinchona and a dime's worth of aniline in that half-gross of bitters. I've gone through towns years afterwards and had folks ask me for 'em again. I hired a wagon that night and commenced selling the bitters on Main Street. Fisher Hill was a low malarial town, and the compound hypothetical pneumocardiac anti-scorbic tonic was just what I diagnosed the crowd as needing. Bitters started off like sweetbreads on toast at a vegetarian dinner. I had sold 2 dozen at 50 cents apiece when I felt somebody pull my coattail. I knew what that meant, so I climbed down and sneaked a $5 bill into the hand of a man with a German silver star on his lapel. Constable, says I, it's a fine night. Have you got a city license, he asks, to sell this illegitimate essence of spooju that you flatter by the name of medicine? I have not, says I didn't know you had a city. If I can find it tomorrow, I'll take out one if it's necessary. I'll have to close you up till you do, says the constable. I quit selling and went back to the hotel. I was talking to the landlord about it. Oh, you won't stand no show in Fisher Hill, says he. Dr. Hoskins, the only doctor here, is the brother-in-law of the mayor, and they won't allow no fake doctor to practice in town. I don't practice medicine, says I. I've got a state peddler's license, and I take out a city one wherever they demand it. I went to the mayor's office the next morning, and they told me he hadn't showed up yet. They didn't know when he'd be down, so Doc Wahoo hunches down again in a hotel chair and lights a Jimson weed regalia and waits. By and by, a young man in a blue necktie slips into the chair next to me and asks the time. 10:30, says I, and you are Andy Tucker. I've seen you work. Wasn't it you that put up the Great Cupid combination package on the southern states? Let's see, it was a Chilean diamond engagement ring, a wedding ring, a potato masher, a bottle of soothing syrup, and Dorothy Vernon, all for 50 cents. Andy was pleased to hear that I remembered him. He was a good street man, and he was more than that. He respected his profession, and he was satisfied with 300% profit. He had plenty of offers to go into the illegitimate drug and garden seed business, but he was never to be tempted off the straight path. I wanted a partner, so Andy and me agreed to go out together. I told him about the situation in Fisher Hill and how finances was low on account of the local mixture of politics and jalop. Andy had just got in on the train that morning. He was pretty low himself and was going to canvass the whole town for a few dollars to build a new battleship by popular subscription at Eureka Springs. So we went out and sat on the porch and talked it over. The next morning at 11 o'clock, when I was sitting there alone, and Uncle Tom shuffles into the hotel and asks for the doctor to come and see Judge Banks, who, it seems, was the mayor and a mighty sick man. "I'm no doctor," says I. "Why don't you go and get the doctor?"
"Boss,"
says he,
"Doc Hoskins am gone 20 miles into country to see some sick persons. He's the only doctor in town, and Master Banks is powerful bad off. He sent me to ask you, please, sir. Come."
"As man to man," says I. "I'll go and look him over." So I put a bottle of Resurrection Bitters in my pocket and goes up the hill to the mayor's mansion, the finest house in town, with a mansard roof and 2 cast-iron dogs on the lawn. This Mayor Banks was in bed, all but his whiskers and feet. He was making internal noises that would have had everybody in San Francisco hiking for the parks. A young man was standing by the bed, holding a cup of water.
"Doc,
Says the mayor.
I'm awful sick. I'm about to die. Can't you do nothing for me?"
"Mr. Mayor," says I, "I'm not a regular preordained disciple of Esculapius. I never took a course in medical college," says I. "I've just come as a fellow man to see if I could be of assistance."
"I'm deeply obliged,"
Says he.
Doc Wahoo. "This is my nephew, Mr. Biddle. He has tried to alleviate my distress, but without success. Oh Lordy, oh.
He sings out. I nods at Mr. Biddle and sits down by the bed and feels the mayor's pulse. "Let me see your your tongue, I mean," says I. Then I turns up the lids of his eyes and looks close at the pupils of them. "How long have you been sick?" I asked.
I was taken down, ouch, last night.
Says the mayor.
Give me something for it, Doc, won't you?"
"Mr. Fiddle," says I, "raise the window shade a bit, will you?" "Biddle," says the young man, "do you feel like you could eat some ham and eggs, Uncle James?" "Mr. Mayor," says I, after laying my ear to his right shoulder blade and listening, "you've got a bad attack of superinflammation of the right clavicle of the harpsichord."
"Good Lord,"
Says he with a groan.
"can't you rub something on it or set it or anything?"
I picks up my hat and starts for the door.
"You ain't going, Doc.
Says the mayor with a howl.
You ain't going away and leave me to die with this superfluity of the clapboards, are you?"
"Common humanity, Dr. Woha," says Mr. Biddle, "ought to prevent you deserting a fellow human in distress." "Dr. Wahoo, when you get through plowing," says I. Then I walks back to the bed and throws back my long hair. "Mr. Mayor," says I, "there is only one hope for you. Drugs will do you no good, but there is another power higher yet, although drugs are high enough," says I.
"And what is that?"
Says he. "Scientific demonstrations," says I. "The triumph of mind over sarsaparilla. The belief that there is no pain and sickness except what is produced when we ain't feeling well. Declare yourself in arrears. Demonstrate."
"What is this paraphernalia you speak of, Doc?"
Says the mayor.
"You ain't a socialist, are you?"
"I am speaking," says I, "of the great doctrine of psychic financiering, of the enlightened school of long-distance, subconscientious treatment of fallacies and meningitis, that wonderful indoor sport known as personal magnetism."
"Can you work it, Doc?"
asks the mayor. "I am one of the sole Sanhedrins and ostensible hooplas of the inner pulpit," says I, "the lame talk and the blind rubber whenever I make a pass at 'em. I am a medium, a coloratura hypnotist, and a spirituous control. It was only through me at the recent seances at Ann Arbor that the late president of the Vinegar Bitters Company could revisit the earth to communicate with his sister Jane. You see me peddling medicine on the street," says I, "to the poor. I don't practice personal magnetism on them. I do not drag it in the dust," says I. because they haven't got the dust.
Will you treat my case?
Asked the mayor. Listen, says I, I've had a good deal of trouble with medical societies everywhere I've been. I don't practice medicine, but to save your life, I'll give you the psychic treatment if you'll agree as mayor not to push the license question.
Of course I will,
Says he.
Now get to work, Doc, for them pains are coming on again.
My fee will be $250, pure guaranteed, and 2 treatments, says I.
All right,
Says the mayor.
I'll pay it. I guess my life's worth that much.
I sat down by the bed and looked him straight in the eye. Now, says I, get your mind off the disease. You ain't sick. You haven't got a heart or a clavicle or a funny bone or brains or anything. You haven't got any pain. Declare error. Now you feel that pain that you didn't have leaving, don't you?
I do feel some better, Doc.
Says the mayor.
Darned if I don't. Now state a few lies about my not having this swelling on my left side, and I think I could be propped up and have some sausage and buckwheat cakes.
I made a few passes with my hands. Now, says I, the inflammation's gone. The right lobe of the perihelion has subsided. You're getting sleepy. You can't hold your eyes open any longer. For the present, the disease is checked. Now you are asleep. The mayor shut his eyes slowly and began to snore. You observe, Mr. Tittle, says I, the wonders of modern science. Biddle, says he, when will you give Uncle the rest of the treatment, Dr. Poo-Poo? Wahoo, says I, I'll come back at 11 tomorrow. When he wakes up, give him 8 drops of turpentine and 3 pounds of steak. Good morning. The next morning I was back on time. Well, Mr. Riddle, says I, when he opened the bedroom door, and how is Uncle this morning? He seems much better, says the young man. The mayor's color and pulse was fine. I gave him another treatment, and he said the last of the pain left him. Now, says I, you'd better stay in bed for a day or 2, and you'll be all right. It's a good thing I happen to be in Fisher Hill, Mr. Mayor, says I, for all the remedies in the cornucopia that regular schools of medicine use couldn't have saved you. And now that error has flew and pain proved a perjurer, let's allude to a cheerfuler subject. Say the fee of $250. No checks, please. I hate to write my name on the back of a check almost as bad as I do on the front.
I've got cash here,
Says the mayor, pulling the pocketbook from under his pillow. He counts out 5 $50 notes and holds them in his hand.
Bring the receipt.
Says to Biddle. I signed the receipt, and the mayor handed me the money. I put it in my inside pocket carefully.
Now do your duty, officer.
Says the mayor, grinning much unlike a sick man. Mr. Biddle lays his hand on my arm. You're under arrest, Dr. Wahoo, alias Peters, says he, for practicing medicine without authority under the state law. Who are you, I asked.
I'll tell you who he is,
Said Mr. Mayor, sitting up in bed.
He's the detective employed by the State Medical Society. He's been following you over 5 counties. He came to me yesterday and we fixed up this scheme to catch you. I guess we won't do any more doctoring around these parts, Mr. Baker. What was it you said I had, Doc?
The mayor laughs.
Compound. Well, it wasn't softening up the brain, I guess, anyway.
A detective, says I. Correct, says Biddle. I'll have to turn you over to the sheriff. Let's see you do it, says I, and I grabs Biddle by the throat and half throws him out the window. But he pulls the gun and sticks it under my chin, and I stand still. And he puts handcuffs on. And, eyewitness, says he, that they're the same bank bills that you and I marked, Judge Banks. I'll turn them over to the sheriff when we get to his office, and he'll send you a receipt. They'll have to be used as evidence in the case.
All right, Mr. Biddle,
Says the mayor.
and now, Doc Wahoo, he goes on, why don't you demonstrate? Can't you pull the cork out of your magnetism with your teeth and hocus-pocus them handcuffs off?
Come on, officer, says I, dignified. I may as well make the best of it. And I turns to old Banks and rattles my chains. Mr. Mayor, says I, the time will come soon when you'll believe that personal magnetism is a success. and you'll be sure that it succeeded in this case too. And I guess it did. When we got nearly to the gate, I says, "We might meet somebody now, Andy. I reckon you better take him off and..." Hey, why, of course, it was Andy Tucker. That was his scheme, and that's how we got the capital to go into business together. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Modern Rural Sports. Jeff Peters must be reminded. Whenever he is called upon, pointedly, for a story, he will maintain that his life has been as devoid of incident as the longest of Trollope's novels. But lured, he will divulge. Therefore I cast many and divers flies upon the currents of his thoughts, before I feel the middle. "I noticed," said I, "that the Western farmers, in spite of their prosperity, are running after their old populistic idols again." "It's the running season," said Jeff, "for farmers, shad, maple trees, and the Conemaugh River." I know something about farmers. I thought I struck one once that had got out of the rut, but Andy Tucker proved me I was mistaken. "Once a farmer, always a sucker," says Andy. "He's the man that's shoved into the front row among bullets, ballots, and the ballet. He's the funny bone and gristle of the country," said Andy, "and I don't know who we would do without him." One morning, me and Andy wakes up with 68 cents between us in a Yellow Pine hotel on the edge of the pre-digested whole cake belt of southern Indiana. How we got off the train the night before, I can't tell you, for she went through the village so fast that what looked like a saloon to us through the car window turned out to be a composite view of a drugstore and a water tank 2 blocks apart. Why we got off at the first station we could belongs to a little Oro-eyed gold watch and Alaska diamond deal we failed to pull off the day before over the Kentucky line. When I woke up, I heard roosters crowing and smelled something like the fumes of nitromuriatic acid, and heard something heavy fall on the floor below us, and the man swearing. "Cheer up, Andy," says I. "We're in a rural community. Somebody has just tested the gold brick downstairs. We'll go out and get what's coming to us from a farmer, and then yoicks and away." Farmers always was a kind of reserve fund to me. Whenever I was in hard luck, I'd go to the crossroads, hook a finger in a farmer's suspender, recite the prospectus of my swindle in a mechanical kind of way, look over what he had, give him back his keys, whetstone, and papers that was of no value except to owner, and stroll away without asking any questions. Farmers are not fair game to me as high up in our business as me and Andy was, but there was times when we found them useful, just as Wall Street does the Secretary of the Treasury now and then. When we went downstairs, we saw we was in the midst of the finest farming section we ever see. About 2 miles away on a hill was a big white house and a grove surrounded by a widespread agricultural agglomeration of fields and barns and pastures and outhouses. "Whose house is that?" we asked the landlord. "That," says he, "is the domicile and the arboreal, terrestrial, and horticultural accessories of Farmer Ezra Plunkett, one of our county's most progressive citizens." After breakfast, me and Andy, with 8 cents capital left, cast the horoscope of the rural potentate. "Let me go alone," says I. 2 of us against one farmer would look as one-sided as Roosevelt using both hands to kill a grizzly. "All right," says Andy. "I like to be a true sport even when I'm only collecting rebates from the rutabaga raisers." "What bait are you going to use for this Ezra thing?" Andy asks me. "Oh," says I, "the first thing that comes to hand in the suitcase. I reckon I'll take along some of the new income tax receipts and the recipe for making clover honey out of clabber and apple peelings, and the order blanks for McGuffey's readers, which afterwards turn out to be McCormick's reapers, and the pearl necklace found on the train, and a pocket-sized gold brick, and "Oh, that'll be enough," says Andy.
Any one of the lot ought to land on Ezra. And say, Jeff, make that succotash fancier give you nice, clean new bills. It's a disgrace to our Department of Agriculture, Civil Service, and Pure Food Law the kind of stuff some of these farmers hand out to use. I've had to take rolls from them that look like bundles of microbe cultures captured out of a Red Cross ambulance.
So I goes to a livery stable and hires a buggy on my looks. I drove out to the Plunkett farm and hitched. There was a man sitting on the front steps of the house. He had a white flannel suit, a diamond ring, golf cap, and a pink ascot tie. Summer boarder, I says to myself. I'd like to see Farmer Ezra Plunkett, I says to him. You see him, says he. What seems to be on your mind? I never answered a word. I stood still, repeating to myself the rollicking lines of that merry jingle, The Man with the Hoe. When I looked at the farmer, the little devices I had in my pocket for buncoing the bush-black browse seemed as hopeless as trying to shake down the beef crust with a minimus and a parlor rifle. Well, says he, looking at me close, speak up. I see the left pocket of your coat sags a good deal. Out with the gold brick first. I'm rather more interested in the bricks than I am in the tricked 60-day notes and the lost silver mine story. I had a kind of cerebral sensation of foolishness in my ideas of ratiocination, but I pulled out my little brick and unwrapped my handkerchief off it. $1.80, says the farmer, hefting it in his hand. Is it a trade? The lead in it is worth more than that, says I, dignified. I put it back in my pocket. All right, says he, but I sort of wanted it for the collection I'm starting. I got a $5,000 one last week for $2.10. Just then, a telephone rings in the house. Come in, Bunk, says the farmer, and look at my place. It's kind of lonesome here sometimes. I think that's New York calling. We went inside. The room looked like a Broadway stockbroker's. Light oak desks, 2 phones, Spanish leather upholstered chairs and couches, oil paintings in gilt frames a foot deep, and a ticker hitting off the news in one corner. Hello, hello, says this funny farmer. Is that the Regent Theater? Yes, this is Plunkett of Woodbine Center. Reserved 4 orchestra seats for Friday evening. My usual ones. Yes, Friday. Goodbye. I run over to New York every 2 weeks to see a show, says the farmer, hanging up the receiver. I catch the 18-hour flyer at Indianapolis, spend 10 hours in the heyday of night on the Yappian Way, and get home in time to see the chickens go to roost 48 hours later. Oh, the pristine Hubbard Squasherino of the cave-dwelling period is getting geared up some for the annual meeting of the Don't Blow Out the Gas Association. Don't you think, Mr. Bunk? I seem to perceive, says I, a kind of hiatus in the agrarian traditions in which heretofore I have reposed confidence. Sure, Bunk, says he. The yellow primrose on the river's brim is getting to look to us rubes like a holiday edition deluxe of the language of flowers, with decal edges and frontispiece. Just then the telephone calls him again. Hello, hello, says he. Oh, that's Perkins at Milldale. I told you $800 was too much for that horse. Have you got him there? Good, let me see him. Get away from the transmitter. Now make him trot in a circle. Faster. Yes, I can hear him. Keep on, faster yet. That'll do. Now lead him up to the phone. Closer. Get his nose nearer. There. Now wait. No, I don't want that horse. What? No, not at any price. He interferes, and he's windbroken. Goodbye. Now, Bunk, says the farmer, do you begin to realize that agriculture has had a haircut? You belong to a bygone era. Why, Tom Lawson himself knows better than to try to catch an up-to-date agriculturalist napping. It's Saturday the 14th on the farm, you bet. Now look here and see how we keep up with the day's doings. He shows me a machine on the table with 2 things for your ears like the penny and the slot affairs. I puts it on and listens.
A female voice starts up reading headlines of murders, accidents, and other political casualties.
What you hear
Says the farmer.
is a synopsis of today's news in the New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco papers. It is wired to our Rural News Bureau and served hot to subscribers. On this table, you see the principal dailies and weeklies of the country. Also, a special service of advance sheets of the monthly magazines.
I picks up one sheet and sees that it's headed Special Advance Proofs. In July 1909, the Century will say, and so forth. The farmer rings up somebody, his manager I reckon, and tells him to let that herd of 15 jerseys go at $600 a head, and to sow the 900-acre field in wheat, and to have 200 extra cans ready at the station for the milk trolley car. Then he passes the Henry Clays and sets out a bottle of green chartreuse and goes over and looks at the ticker tape.
Consolidated gas up 2 points, says he. Oh, very well.
Ever monkey with copper? I asks.
Stand back, says he, raising his hands, or I'll call the dog. I told you not to waste your time.
After a while, he says,
Bunk, if you don't mind my telling you, your company begins to cloy slightly. I've got to write an article on the chimera of communism for a magazine and attend a meeting of the Racetrack Association this afternoon. Of course, you understand by now that you can't get my proxy for your remedy, whatever it may be.
well, sir, all I could think of to do was to go out and get in the buggy. The horse turned round and took me back to the hotel. I hitched him and went in to see Andy. In his room, I told him about this farmer, word for word, and I sat picking at the table cover like one bereft of sagaciousness. I don't understand it, says I, humming a sad and foolish little song to cover my humiliation. Andy walks up and down the room for a long time, biting the left end of his mustache, as he does when in the act of thinking. Jeff, he says finally, I believe your story of this expurgated rustler, but I am not convinced. It looks incredulous to me that he could have inoculated himself against all the preordained systems of bucolic bungo. Now, you never regarded me as a man of special religious proclivities, did you, Jeff? Asked Andy. Well, says I, no. But, says I, not to wound his feelings, I have also observed many church members whose said proclivities were not so outwardly developed that they would show on a white handkerchief if you rubbed them with it.
I have always been a deep student of nature from creation down,
says Andy, and I believe in an ultimatum design of Providence. Farmers was made for a purpose, and that was to furnish a livelihood to men like me and you. Else, why was we given brains? It is my belief that the manna that the Israelites lived on for 40 years in the wilderness was only a figurative word for farmers, and they kept up the practice to this day. And now, says Andy, I am going to test my theory. Once a farmer, always a come-on, in spite of the veneering and the orifices that a spurious civilization has brought to him. You'll fail, same as I did, says I. This one shook off the shackles of the sheepfold. He's entrenched behind the advantages of electricity, education, literature, and intelligence. I'll try, said Andy. There are certain laws of nature that free rural delivery can't overcome. Andy fumbles around a while in the closet and comes out dressed in a suit with brown and yellow checks as big as your hand. His vest is red with blue dots, and he wears a high silk hat. I noticed he had soaked his sandy mustache in a kind of blue ink. Great Barnums, says I. You are a ringer for a circus thimble rig man. Right, says Andy. Is the buggy outside? Wait here till I come back. I won't be long. 2 hours afterwards, Andy steps into the room and lays a wad of money on the table. $860, said he. Let me tell you, he was in. He looked me over and began to guide me. I didn't say a word, but got out the walnut shells and began to roll the little ball on the table. I whistled a tune or two, and then I started up the old formula. Step up lively, gentlemen, says I, and watch the little ball. It costs you nothing to look. There you see it, there you don't. Guess where the little joker is. The quickness of the hand deceives the eye. I steal to look at the farmer. I see the sweat coming out on his forehead. Goes over and closes the front door and watches me some more. Directly he says,
I'll bet you 20 I can pick the shell the ball's under now.
after that, goes on Andy, there is nothing new to relate. He had only $860 in cash in the house. When I left, he followed me to the gate. There was tears in his eyes when he shook hands.
Bunk,
Says he,
thank you for the only real pleasure I've had in years. It brings up happy old days when I was only a farmer and not an agriculturalist. God bless you.
here Jeff Peters ceased, and I inferred that his story was done. Then you think, I began. Yes, said Jeff, something like that. You let the farmers go ahead and amuse themselves with politics. Farming's a lonesome life, and they've been against the shell game before. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of The Gentle Grafter by O.Henry, Chair of Philanthromathematics. I see that the cause of education has received the princely gift of more than $50 million, said I. I was gleaning the stray items from the evening papers while Jeff Peters packed his briar pipe with a plug in it. Which same, said Jeff, calls for a new deck and a recitation by the entire class in philanthromathematics. Is that an illusion, I asked. It is, said Jeff. I never told you about the time when me and Andy Tucker was philanthropists, did I? It was 8 years ago in Arizona. Andy and me was out in the Gila Mountains with a 2-horse wagon prospecting for silver. We struck it and sold out to parties in Tucson for $25,000. They paid our check at the bank in silver, $1,000 in a sack. We loaded it in our wagon and drove east 100 miles before we recovered our presence of intellect. $25,000 doesn't sound like so much when you're reading the annual report of the Pennsylvania Railroad or listening to an actor talking about his salary. But when you can raise up a wagon sheet and kick around your boot heel and hear every one of them ring against another, it makes you feel like you was a night and day bank with the clock striking 12. The third day out, we drove into one of the most specious and tidy little towns that nature or Rand and McNally ever turned out. It was in the foothills and mitigated with trees and flowers and about 2,000 head of cordial and dilatory inhabitants. The town seemed to be called Floresville, and nature had not contaminated it with many railroads, fleas, or eastern tourists. Me and Andy deposited our money to the credit of Peters and Tucker in the Esperanza Savings Bank and got rooms at the Skyview Hotel. After supper, we lit up and sat out on the gallery and smoked. Then was when the philanthropy idea struck me. I suppose every grafter gets it sometime. When a man swindles the public out of a certain amount, he begins to get scared and wants to return part of it. And if you'll watch close and notice the way his charity runs, you'll see that he tries to restore it to the same people he got it from. As a hydrostatical case, take, let's say, A. A made his millions selling oil to poor students who sit up nights studying political economy and methods for regulating the trusts. So back to the universities and colleges goes his conscience dollars. There's B, got his from the common laboring man that works with his hands and tools. How's he to get some of the remorse fund back into their overalls? Aha, says B, I'll do it in the name of education. I've skinned the laboring man, says he to himself, but according to the old proverb,
charity covers a multitude of skins. So he puts up $80 million worth of libraries, and the boys with the dinner pail that fills them gets the benefit. Where's the books? Asked the reading public. I dinna ken, says B. I offered ye libraries, and there they are. I suppose if I'd given ye preferred steel trust stock instead, you'd have wanted the water in it set out in cut glass decanters. Who to you? But as I said, the owning of so much money was beginning to give me philanthropitis. It was the first time me and Andy had ever made a pile big enough to make us stop and think how we got it. Andy, says I, we are wealthy, not beyond the dreams of average, but in our humble way we are comparatively as rich as greasers. I feel I'd like to do something for as well as to humanity. I was thinking the same thing, Jeff, says he. We've been gouging the public for a long time with all kinds of little schemes, from selling self-igniting celluloid collars to flooding Georgia with Hoax Milk presidential campaign buttons. I'd like, myself, to hedge a bet or two in the graft game if I could do it without actually banging the Cymbalines in the Salvation Army or teaching a Bible class by the Bertillon system. What will we do? Asked Andy. Give free grub to the poor or send a couple thousand to George Cortelyou? Neither, says I. We've got too much money to be implicated in plain charity, and we haven't got enough to make restitution. So we'll look about for something that's about halfway between the two. The next day, in walking around Floresville, we see on a hill a big red brick building that appears to be disinhabited. The citizens speak up and tell us that it was begun for a residence several years before by a mine owner. After running up the house, he finds he only had $2.80 left to furnish it with. So he invests that in whiskey and jumps off the roof on a spot where he now requiescats in pieces. As soon as me and Andy saw that building, the same idea struck both of us. We would fix it up with lights and pen wipers and professors, and put an iron dog and statues of Hercules and Father John on the lawn, and start one of the finest free educational institutions in the world, right here. So we talks it over with the prominent citizens of Floresville, who falls in fine with the idea. They give a banquet in the engine house to us, and we make our bow for the first time as benefactors to the cause of progress and enlightenment. Andy makes an hour-and-a-half speech on the subject of irrigation in Lower Egypt, and we have a moral tune on the phonograph and pineapple sherbet. Andy and me don't lose any time in philanthropy. We put every man in town that could tell a hammer from a stepladder to work on the building, divided it up into classrooms and lecture halls. We wired to Frisco for a carload of desks, footballs, arithmetics, pen holders, dictionaries, chairs for the professors, slates, skeletons, sponges, 27 cravat-knitted gowns and caps for the senior class, and an open order for all the truck that goes with the first-class university. I took it on myself to put a campus and a curriculum on the list, but the telegraph operator must have got the words wrong, being an ignorant man, for when the goods came, we found a can of peas and a curry comb among them. While the weekly papers was having chalk plate cuts of me and Andy, we wired an employment agency in Chicago to express us FOB 6 professors immediately. 1 English literature, 1 up-to-date dead languages, 1 chemistry, 1 political economy, Democrat preferred, 1 logic, and 1 wise to painting, Italian, and music with union card. The Esperanza Bank guaranteed salaries, which was to run between $800 and $800.50. Well, sir, we finally got in shape. Over the front door was carved the words, "The World's University, Peters and Tucker, patrons and proprietors." And when September the 1st got a cross mark on the calendar, the come-ons began to roll in. First, the faculty got off the Tri-Weekly Express from Tucson. They was mostly young, spectacled, and red-headed, with sentiments divided between ambition and food. Andy and me got 'em billeted on the Floresvillans, and then laid for the students. They came in bunches. We had advertised the university in all the state papers, and it did us good to see how quick the country responded. 219 husky lads, aging along up from 18 to chin whiskers, answered the clarion call for free education. They ripped open that town, sponged the seams, turned it, lined it with new mohair, and you couldn't have told it from Harvard or Goldfields at the March term of court. They marched up and down the streets, waving flags with the world's university colors, ultramarine and blue. And they certainly made a lively place at Floresville. Andy made them a speech from the balcony of the Skyview Hotel, and the whole town was out celebrating. In about 2 weeks, the professors got the students disarmed and herded into classes. I don't believe there's any pleasure equal to being a philanthropist. Me and Andy bought high silk hats and pretended to dodge the 2 reporters from the Floresville Gazette. The paper had a man to Kodak us whenever we appeared on the street, and ran our pictures every week over the column headed Educational Notes. Andy lectured twice a week at the university, and afterward I would rise and tell a humorous story. Once the Gazette printed my pictures with Abe Lincoln on one side and Marshall P. Wilder on the other. Andy was as interested in philanthropy as I was. We used to wake up nights and tell each other new ideas for booming the university. Andy, says I to him one day, there's something we overlooked. The boys ought to have dromedaries. What's that? Andy asks. Why, something to sleep in, of course, says I. All colleges have them. Oh, you mean pajamas, says Andy. I do not, says I mean dromedaries. But I never could make Andy understand, so we never ordered them. Of course, I meant them long bedrooms in colleges where the scholars sleep in a row. Well, sir, the World's University was a success. We had scholars from 5 states and territories, and Floresville had a boom. A new shooting gallery and a pawn shop, and 2 more saloons started. And the boys got up a college yell that went this way. Raw, 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 dun, dun, dun. Peters, Tucker, lots of fun. Bow, wow, wow, haw, hee, haw. World University, hip, hoorah. The scholars was a fine lot of young men, and me and Andy was as proud of them as if they belonged to our own family. But one day, about the last of October, Andy comes to me and asks if I have any idea how much money we had left in the bank. I guess it's about $16,000. Our balance, says Andy, is $821.62. What, says I with a kind of yell, do you mean to tell me that them infernal clod-hopping, dough-headed, pup-faced, goose-brained, gate-stealing, rabbit-eared sons of horse thieves have soaked us for that much? No less, says Andy. Well then, to Helvetia with philanthropy, says I. Not necessarily, said Andy. Philanthropy, says he, when run on a good business basis, is one of the best grafts going. I'll look into the matter and see if it can't be straightened out. Next week, I'm looking over the payroll of our faculty when I run across a new name. Professor James Darnley McCorkle, Chair of Mathematics, salary $100 per week. I yell so loud that Andy runs in quick. What's this, says I, a professor of mathematics at more than $5,000 a year? How did this happen? Did he get in through the window and appoint himself? I wired Frisco for him a week ago, says Andy. In ordering the faculty, we seem to overlook the chair of mathematics. Good thing we did, says I. We can pay his salary 2 weeks, and then our philanthropy will look like the 9th hole on the Ski-Bowl golf links. Wait a while, says Andy, and see how things turn out. We have taken up too noble a cause to draw out now. Besides, the further I gaze into the retail philanthropy business, the better it looks to me. I never thought about investigating it before. Come to think of it now, goes on Andy, all the philanthropists I ever knew had plenty of money. I ought to have looked into that matter long ago and located which was the cause and which was the effect. I had confidence in Andy's chicanery in financial affairs, so I left the whole thing in his hands. The university was flourishing fine, and me and Andy kept our silk hats shined up, and Floresville kept heaping honors on us like we was millionaires instead of almost busted philanthropists. The students kept the town lively and prosperous. Some stranger came to town and started a faro bank over the Red Front livery stable and began to amass money in quantities. Me and Andy strolled up one night and piked $1 or $2 for sociability. There were about 50 of our students there, drinking rum punches and shoving high stacks of blues and reds about the table as the dealer turned the cards up. "Why, dang it, Andy," says I, "these free school hunting, gander-headed, silk-socked little sons of sapsuckers have got more money than you and me ever had. Look at the rolls they're pulling out of their pistol pockets." "Yes," says Andy, "a good many of them are sons of wealthy miners and stockmen. It's very sad to see them wasting their opportunities this way." At Christmas, all the students went home to spend the holidays. We had a farewell blowout at the university, and Andy lectured on modern music and prehistoric literature of the archipelagos. Each one of the faculty answered to toasts and compared me and Andy to Rockefeller and the Emperor Marcus Autolycus. I pounded on the table and yelled for Professor McCorkle, but it seems he wasn't present on the occasion. I wanted to look at the man that Andy thought could earn $100 a week in philanthropy. That was the point of making an assignment. The students all left on the night train, and the town sounded as quiet as the campus of a correspondence school at midnight. When I went to the hotel, I saw a light in Andy's room, and I opened the door and walked in. There sat Andy with the faro dealer at a table, dividing a 2-foot-high stack of currency in $1,000 packages. "Correct," says Andy, $31,000 apiece. "Come in, Jeff," says he. "This is our share of the profits of the first half of the scholastic term of the World's University, incorporated and philanthropated. Are you convinced now," says Andy, "that philanthropy, when practiced in a business way, is an art that blesses him who gives as well as him who receives?" "Great," says I, feeling fine. "I'll admit you are the doctor this time." "We'll be leaving in the morning train," says Andy. "You better get your collars and cuffs and press clippings together." "Great," says I. "I'll be ready." "But Andy," says I wish I could have met that Professor James Darnley McCorkle before we went. I had a curiosity to know the man."
Oh, that'll be easy.
Says Andy, turning around to the faro dealer. "Jim," says Andy, "shake hands with Mr. Peters." End of chapter 4.